In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how we're going to use the grid technique. This is one of two techniques that we can use to transfer our images to our paper. So on the left hand side, what I did is I took my gridded image and I taped it back onto a piece of my sketchbook paper. And on the side, on the left hand side, I numbered it from 1 to 10. And on the top, I labeled it from A all the way through H. So what this will help us do is it'll help us break down the placement of each square on the left hand side and then help us kind of place it on the right hand side. So as we move through the composition, we can much more easily figure out where the information needs to be. The good news is that even though there's 80 squares, not every single square is going to have information in it. So if we look at A1, for instance, all we have is a gray background, and we really don't start getting any information until we get into C1. And then even at that point, as we go through that full first row, we only have information in rows C, D, and E. So C1, D1, and E1 have information. And then as we move through the rest of that row, we don't really have anything else to worry about as far as contours go. When we move into row 2, we do have more and more activation. In this case, what we want to do is kind of take into account where the key contour is, what's going to give us the most information, or what's the information there that's the information that's the most important. So if we're looking at square B2, we see a lot of kind of stray hairs, but within those stray hairs, we can kind of see the general kind of mass of the hair, which is the darker area that we can see here, right in there. So whenever we do our contour transfer, we want to transfer that dark edge, right? So the benefit of working with the grid technique is that it is a little bit more methodical. It helps you kind of break down the image into their 1 by 1 inch squares, and you can tackle it on a kind of square by square basis, and you don't really have to focus on worrying about the larger picture. If we were to try to draw this whole thing at once, it would be very difficult, definitely for a beginner, to try to tackle all that information, and then put on top of that the fact that we're working with kind of an abstracted image, and we're kind of going to be in a difficult spot, right? So the way we want to work with this is to go in and fill in whatever information we see in each square 1 by 1, and by the time we make it through all the way down to the bottom, we will have complete contour drawing, right? So if we're going back to the very first drawings that we were doing at the beginning of the semester, you'll remember that I wanted you guys to work general to specific. So we're looking for key contours first, and then while we're there, if we see any kind of highlight shapes or shadow shapes, be sure to jot those down so that we can start mapping things as we move through. So once we've hit one square, before moving on to the next square, make sure that you have the key contours kind of mapped out in each square, and just take it slowly, right? So as we move through, don't rush this, and really kind of focus on the placement of objects within the square, right? So another kind of tool that we can use is as far as placement goes, we can look at where things start to hit, or where lines start to hit on our square. So if we talk about, say for instance, the crease that we see right in here, we can say that that crease hits our square, what is that, 6C. It hits 6C just below that kind of halfway point. And then if we're looking at the point where it intersects at the bottom here, we're kind of in a similar position where in 6C, on that bottom edge, we're just a little bit past that halfway point. So we can make a little mark there. So whenever we transfer our contour line from this box to this box, we can kind of get a better feel for where that line's going to hit based on where it hit in that box. One thing that helps too is if we can kind of put a little dot there to kind of remind us. We can put a dot here and a dot here just to kind of see where exactly it starts to hit. And that placement is going to be really important, not only for the information inside of that box, but then as it carries into the next box, that placement, if it's just a little bit off, could shift the information in the subsequent boxes afterwards. So be very precise in terms of where you put your contours. Again, this is still the skeleton of the drawing. So the stronger our structure is at the beginning, the better off we're going to be at the end, right? If it helps, you can also put the your letters and numbers on your actual drawing here. Just remember to jot those in lightly so that you don't pick up on them later on. So whenever your drawing is fully complete, we want this thing to be as clean as possible. So in the same way that we want to keep our grid lines kind of light, any kind of notes that we put on the outside here, we do want to keep light as well. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do just a quick contour on the first, let's say the first 3 rows, just to kind of show you what I mean by picking up the key contours. So I know that in A1 and then B1, I don't really have any information. And then once I get into C1, I start to see a little bit of that hair starting to come in. So if I'm looking at where the hair hits here, it's pretty much right at the middle of my C, on the bottom, on that bottom edge there. And then as I move into this right edge, it looks like it hits just below that kind of 3rd point. So again, C1, it kind of hits here and then right about there. So for C1, that's all I have to worry about in terms of a contour. When we get into D1, we kind of start to see that hair start to kind of dip down and then kind of kick back up again. So again, I'm going to pick up where I left off, and then I'm going to look for where that little roundness starts to happen. And it looks like it goes past this halfway point, and then it starts to really kind of round out right about here before kicking up and then hitting right in here. So now we're in E1, and in E1 we see that little bit of hair kind of wave down this way and then hit right in there. So the tendency is going to be to kind of want to follow that contour through from E1 down into E2. We could do that, but if you really want to kind of be really strict about the way we proceed through this, and you say, well, I really want to tackle it row through row, stick with it, right? We can kind of get out of hand and derailed by trying to tackle this entire contour as it kind of goes through here, and we can kind of lose control. So it's better to just kind of take it one step at a time here. So like I said before, A1, B1, no information. C1, we get some information. D1, E1, and then as we finish out with our F, G, and H, there's really not too much else for us to worry about in this row, so we can go ahead and move on to the next one. So in A2, nothing there, and then now in B2, we start to see basically where the bulk of this hair starts to kind of come in. So like I said, there is a lot of kind of loose hairs in here, so what we can do is kind of look for the bulk of that hair where we see the kind of the darkness in the body of the hair, and we can actually squint our eyes a little bit so that we don't really focus so much on the really stray hairs, and then focus on what that information looks like. So if it helps, talk your way through it. So where this hair hits here is just before the halfway point of my box. So I know that I'm going to go ahead and start it just about here. And then we can look at where it starts to intersect on that right side. So it looks like it hits just above the halfway point. So we're going to carry it through here. And then in C2, all we're really missing is this bridge that kind of starts to connect that contour through there. So once we have this outer contour, we do kind of see a little bit of the hairline starting to develop in C2 as well. So again, if we squint, we can kind of see where that hairline starts to kind of come in, and it's a pretty shallow slope, and it looks like it starts off back this way, just before the halfway point, and then we can follow that up to about here. So I'm kind of starting with these dots, and then I'm connecting those contours, just to kind of make that a little bit easier for me to sight and spot. So as we move into D2, we'll do the same thing. We'll squint, and this hairline is kind of organic. It's not super clear where that hairline is. So I'll just kind of drop in a light line just to kind of guide me through the next step. And then at this point, we actually have the clean split between our left side of our image and our right side of our image. So if we try to kind of follow that contour, that information is really no longer there, right? So once we get into E2, we kind of get into this darkness. It's like super black in here. And then once we get into, it looks like F2, we start to get more of that hair. There is a tiny little bit of information here on E2 that we could pick up, and it looks like the hair just kind of creeps into this corner. And then once we get into F2, we can kind of follow that stray hair out. And it takes us from this corner down right into the corner of F2, and it looks like just a little bit before then too. So we have that outer strand, and then we also have this little bit of an inner strand here, which is kind of like the bulk of the hair. And then for G2 and H2, there's not really anything else for us to render there. So once we get into A3, again, we have some of those stray hairs kind of clumping up, but they're a little bit thicker here, so they do become a little bit more important to render as we get into A3. So I will go ahead and kind of drop in some of the body of that hair, some of those curves and curls, and it's a pretty loose contour, and I'm just going to kind of pick up more or less where those kind of start to hit in there. And then in B3, we have that hairline kind of coming in. And again, it's super organic, so I'm just going to kind of drop in a few lines in here to tell me more or less where it is. But I won't worry about doing every single hair. As we come into the forehead in C3 and in CD, there's not really a lot of information there. We do have, looks like in C3, we have a couple little freckles that come in. Again, kind of a minor detail, but if we leave it blank, we might miss it later on. And then as we move into, looks like into D3, we actually do have a little bit of that hairline starting to kind of creep in. So we'll just kind of do some little scribbles in there to give us that information. In E3, the hairline shifts to about halfway down the forehead. And then as we get into F3, we kind of get this curve coming through here. G3, we have the outer curve of the hair that hits right about halfway into our square. And then by H3, we don't have any other information to really focus on. So I'm going to continue this process and show you what it looks like after I get the full contour drawing done. So right here, my full contour drawing is complete. You can tell here on the right hand side where I have more of my shadows that I did map out my shadow shapes. Those are going to be very, very important again in giving us that kind of nice full richness in the right side of the face. And you can tell that the shadows really kind of help build the structure on this right side. So as you're drawing, again, try to focus on getting the key contours in first, and then after you have that ready, then you can start to focus on any kind of shadow shapes that you see in your square before moving on to the next one. So in this process, again, once we have the strong contour built in, we have the structure built in, now we can come back in with our pencils and start to drop in the values, and we can attack the value the exact same way we just did our contours, and really just try to get it get that value in one square at a time. This is the first option that we have in completing our portrait projects. So the next method will be our transfer technique. So if you want to see what the two different options are, make sure you watch both options before deciding which route you want to take, and be sure to check out the other video. Now that we have our contour fully rendered, our next step is going to be adding in our values. So in this case, we still want to attack this drawing one square at a time. Before we do that though, we can kind of take a note from some of our earlier exercises in the semester. And if you recall, whenever we did the shading on exercise 4, the first thing we did was try to track our darkest values. So a lot of times the darkest values, again, are going to give us some structure in our drawing, but ultimately they're also going to cap off what the darkest things are going to be in our composition, in our drawing, right? So dropping that information in first will help give us the kind of beginning of a structure, and then afterwards we can start to look at what our brightest highlights are. What are the things that are going to stay a nice kind of sharp white, and then everything else is going to be somewhere in between, right? So let's go ahead and start by tracking our darkest blacks and getting that value dropped in. Once I have the darkest values in my drawing blocked in, you can see how the drawing is already taking on a lot more structure, and we have not only the strength of the contour kind of giving us some direction of where to go next, but also we have the highest value dropped in, so that we know that the other values that we have in our composition shouldn't get any darker than the blacks that we've established at this point. So the next step is going to be, if you guys want to pull out your value scale and have it next to your artwork, to drop in the rest of your values. So now that we have our ultimate black, we can identify what the widest values are in our composition and decide what parts of our drawing are going to be left the white of the paper. By looking at this composition, I could say that there are only really a very small number of areas where I would leave it the pure white of the paper, and those areas are going to be in the teeth, and then in a few kind of select places in the eyes, but everywhere else should have at least some value from the 2 to 7 range. When it comes to the background, you do want to drop in some kind of value in the background. You don't want to leave that blank, but at the same time, if your background is looking very busy, if there's a lot of things behind you in your photograph, don't feel like you have to draw every single thing that's in the background. Dropping in a flat value like a 3 or a 4 on your value scale, or if you require a darker value of gray, is good too. So before we drop in those values, those flat values in the background, what we do want to do is erase out any part of the grid that we know we're no longer going to utilize, so that we don't have to worry about the grid still kind of showing through our drawing. So in the background, if you know you're going to use a light value, a light gray in the background, do yourself a favor and go in there and erase out the grid. Make sure you maintain this kind of outer border that's around your piece, so that we have a bounding box still, but feel free to erase out the grid lines that you dropped in that you won't be using anymore. Same in the face. If there's any delicate areas that you would like to keep a very light gray, make sure that you do erase out the grid anywhere where you no longer need it. And with that, we're going to wrap up the grid process. One other tip that some of you guys did bring up, but I did not announce previously, is the use of a cover sheet. So what a cover sheet is going to help us do is it's going to help us keep our drawing as clean as possible. I'm sure you noticed that when you're working at this scale, that you track some graphite on your palm as you're drawing, or if it's with the charcoal, you'll notice that you probably dragged or smeared that charcoal around. So what you can do to help kind of mitigate that a little bit is using a sheet from your sketchbook. You can place your cover sheet over the area of your drawing that you have completed, and you're going to use your pencil and kind of hover over the area where you don't have your cover sheet here. So again, your hand kind of wants to be here on the edge, and then your palm is going to be covered and protected so that you're not smearing the graphite all the way across your drawing. That'll wrap up the grid process, the grid drawing process. The next video is going to be your second option. So if you're watching this one first, check out the pressure transfer video,